Konnichiwa everyone. Today we're going to talk about my favorite topic of Japanese woodworking, and that is planes. Yes, these are the heart and soul of many a Japanese woodworker's workshop. And I'm going to be talking a little bit today about the various types that we have here. These are the three main types that you're going to see in a lot of guys' workshops and on the videos on the various YouTube. But what I'm going to be doing today is not going to be about setup. I have told myself I'll never do a setup video. There's tons of good resources on that. I'll leave a link if you guys wanted to learn more about setup and how to set up your plane at the end of the video, or in the description box down below, you know, whatever works best. But anyway, we're going to be talking about what makes these planes very unique in the woodworking world, how they're built, and what the different parts are. This is going to cover just the basic anatomy of a Kanna, and this is intended for people who are brand new to this. If you already know this stuff, this may not be that interesting to you, but you know, refresher courses are always fun. To get started with this, we're just going to be talking about the basic plane that you're going to see in every one of my videos and every other Japanese woodworker's video. This is a standard Japanese hand plane. This is basically the crux of the entire workshop. The average blade width is going to be about 70 millimeters. And if you're talking about blade sizes, one of the things you'll need to realize is it's from side to side here all the way over to here. That's how the measurements are taken. They're not of the actual edge. And if you look at the edge here, you can see it's just inside that. So if you buy a 70 millimeter plane, keep in mind the cutting edge is not going to be 70 millimeters. It's going to be just a little bit narrower than that. And there is actually a proper way to take these out of the blocks. I've seen guys strike them on the back. I've seen guys strike them on the corners. Honestly, the way I was taught to do it was you strike here on these little rolled over ears. What that does is it lets the wood actually take the brunt force of the hammer, and you're not driving it directly into the grain. If you drive directly into the grain, eventually you can force this to warp out on the bottom. You really don't want that. It makes tuning a nightmare. So the way I have been taught to remove these is simply alternate your strikes on either one of these. Usually pop right out. The chip breaker comes out first. Blade's stuck a little more in there. What that does is that lets that blade kind of work its way out like that. So you can think about like a pair of shoulders going back and forth, and they come right out just like that. Now the blades of Japanese planes are actually really cool. It's a really interesting design, and they've kind of refined it for quite a few years, you know, several hundred. What I get the most questions about is actually this. This little hollow on the back here is actually called the ura, and that's just scalloped is what that word means, or hollow. If I'm wrong about that, someone can correct me in the comments, I'm sure. What the ura does is a couple of things. If you look at this here, this blade is not exactly perfectly flat. What the ura does is it isolates that edge right there. This is the only part of this that's flat. I never flatten all the way back here because the wood never makes contact with the blade back here. But having the ura there actually focuses your sharpening on the very edge of the plane, and you don't work this side nearly as much as you work this side. If you're sharpening, you're always going to sharpen the angled side here more than you're going to sharpen this side. This side is simply for keeping the edge flat against the body on this side here so that your cuts come out nice and even. There's a lot of different methods from a lot of different guys on keeping these flat, so I won't digress into that. But to make things simple, on the back of your Kanna blade, and if you were to refer to the blade by itself, you could call it the Kanna noha. The scallop in the middle is called the ura, and this is the edge. So the edge is just that little line going right across the front there. So if you look on the back here, you'll actually see something that confuses a lot of people about these. This is actually a highly polished layer of steel, that little line right there. And behind that is a bunch of soft iron. Now the reason that is because when a blade gets to the point to where you've actually eaten into the ura here, you do a technique that's called tapping out. I've done this on the channel a few times. If you go back and look at some of the videos, you can see what I do for it. There's a couple of different ways to achieve that, but basically when you get to that point where you no longer have a flat edge right here, you don't want to grind down past this, because then you'll have a step and you'll have a nice flat edge here, and then you'll have a little flat point right there where you make your new edge. Instead, what you do is this soft iron back here won't shatter if you strike it with a hammer. So you place this up on a backer, let's just imagine this is an anvil, and you tap the soft iron back here, and what that does is it causes that front edge of that steel to curl over like that. So then when you go to flatten it, you'll actually be able to get an edge here without having to grind away a massive amount of steel. It's a really ingenious design, and it makes these last just a really, really long time. It's not quite as efficient as just having a simply perfectly flat back, but it does look really cool, and honestly I can say that it is quite a bit different from a cutting perspective. It just feels like there's less friction, and that's also to do with the wood body. But having become a fan of these in recent years, and well, maybe a little more than recent years, but I have grown to love these, and I actually like maintaining them. Tapping out is just a perfectly normal part of life for a Kanna blade. I would just say that if you've got a small one, tapping out is very difficult. I don't recommend doing that unless you've got a larger blade like a 70 or a 55 millimeter. And so, putting these back into the block here, the block actually has a very specific name. The block is called a die. And if you were to refer to a person who makes a die, you'd call it a die-ya, which is basically a die merchant. So there's a couple of different things that make these different, and one of the things is the actual cutting angle. Most Japanese Kanna, I've noticed, are actually have the blade angled at about 40 degrees. Does that make a difference in cutting hardwood? Yes, it does. Does it make it harder? No, it doesn't. It's more about how you have these things set up than the actual blade. If you expect your tool to do all the work for you, you're not much of a craftsman, and I will say that without hesitation, because I've seen guys and myself pull, pretty thin shavings off of really, really hard woods like ash and ebony, and it's just about getting it set up and having a sharp blade. You can't expect the tool to do everything for you. Now, getting back on topic to the topic at hand, forgot to mention, this little guy right here is the chip breaker. Now, this has a name, and it is called the uragane, and I'm probably mispronouncing this, so don't kill me. But this little guy has the exact same job as on a modern plane, and that is breaking the chips and giving you a little bit better shaving. And so I'm going to take apart my jointer plane here, because it's got a little bit better setup on the chip breaker than the other one. So always alternating those hits will save the die a lot of breakage in the future. Now the chip breaker does the exact same thing on a Japanese plane as a chip breaker does on a modern Western style plane. Having that extra edge at that right angle there, not a right angle, extra angle. Anyway, having that edge right there, just right up to that point, not in line with it, just barely behind it like that. What that does is that forces the chip to take a harder turn, and it prevents tear out. And trust me, on really knotty hardwoods, that is a wonderful feature to have. Now, setting those up for a Japanese plane is the exact same method as you would for a Western plane. You simply make sure that they're flat across the front. The only other difference with a Japanese plane is you have ears on either side that you have to adjust. But it's really the same concept. You just got to get it close to the edge, and it does the exact same thing for a Japanese plane as it does for a Western plane. Now, another thing that confuses people about Japanese planes a lot is the way the soles are tuned. Now, once you've done your initial setup, you've got the blade fit to the die and everything, you have to tune the sole. Now, on a simple smoothing plane like this, standard 70mm, nothing special about it, you're only going to tune 2 points of the sole, and that is the mouth here and the toe here. You never tune any of this back here. Let me grab a straight edge, I'll show you what I'm talking about. And one thing I will say with setup, if you're going to check the sole, you need to make sure that the blade is as close as you can get it to the mouth there. So you don't want it sticking out where the edge will make contact with the ruler, or the square, or whatever it is you're using to tune. I'm going to get it to where I've just got an edge showing and then back it out ever so slightly. Keep in mind, don't ever try to do that if it's brand new out of the box, because they do not come set up or fit for the blade. You do need to follow an instructional on how to do that, and I'll leave you a link to the book that can show you how. So once you have the blade as close to the edge as you can get it, you don't want it poking out at all, because you don't want to blunt it with your ruler or your square. You're only going to hit this on 2 points, and it might be really hard to see this on camera. Okay, that might be impossible to see really well, but if you look, there's a little bit of a scallop right here in the middle, in between the toe and the mouth of the blade, of the die, actually I should say. And at the very end, we have a full gap. Now what that basically is referred to is called a 2-point setup. Now a 2-point setup is basically all that you're going to use for every plane except for a joiner plane. Now the reason that you don't use a 3-point is because on a smoothing plane, you're not actually trying to square things up. All you're trying to do is smooth things out and make things look nice and pretty. So it's really pointless to have all this back here making contact with the wood, because when you get them from the maker, this is going to be extremely hollow. If you do flatten it to where you can get this to make contact, you're going to be removing a ton of wood up here, and you're going to drastically shorten the lifespan of your die. They are designed to only use the 2-point when they're short like this. You can force it to do a 3-point, but I really don't recommend it. It's just a good way to shorten your lifespan, and you won't get as much out of your die as you possibly can. Keep in mind that the real heart and soul of it is the blade, and a blade can go through probably 10 die in its whole lifetime before it's all used up, unless you're just really hard on your tools. The other part of using a 2-point method is that it does make tuning these a lot simpler than if you're using a 3-point. If you're using a 3-point, you're just adding extra friction back there that you don't technically need to smooth out wood. Now the other part of a Kanna that's important to note is the pin. The pin simply serves one purpose, and that is to provide a little point of contact for the chip breaker here. You can't have a big giant piece of wood going over here, or else you'd never be able to tune this right. And if your pin is making contact all the way across, it's probably putting too much pressure. The recommended setup is to just have it be in the center, either right there or kind of across that. It's a pretty minute point, but it does make a difference if you're doing finer work. Now, the other type of Kanna that is commonly seen is this. This is called a Nagadai Kanna, and this is a Japanese jointer plane. Now, the only difference between this and a smoothing plane, you still have the chip breaker, you have the blade, you have your pin, is the fact that the Nagadai Kanna is much longer and the sole is tuned a little bit differently. Now, like I said earlier, with the smoothing plane, you're only going to use a 2-point method. So you're only going to tune here and you're only going to tune there. Get those points squared up. All of this back here should be hollow. On a Nagadai Kanna, you're actually going to do something a little bit different. What you're going to do is you're actually going to have a contact point back here, here, and here. Now, the reason the 3-point tuning is very important is because if you've got a large piece of wood like this, and let's just imagine you're tuning up the edge. I'm not actually going to do it. This is just a random piece of scrap. But if you're tuning up the edge like this, making cuts here and here, the moment that the edge of your toe here actually passes the edge of the wood, if you don't have the balance back here, this will either tip forward depending on how you're putting pressure, or it will tip backwards like that. Actually reverse that. It'll tip forwards this way or backwards that way, and what that will do is that'll create a little bit of a hollow on the edge of your wood here. When you have the 3-point method of contact, what that does is it creates a reference point behind the blade, and you still have the reference in front of the mouth. So even if you're cutting down the entire length of the board here, and you get to this point right about there, you still have a contact point here at the edge of the foot, or the heel I should say. It's the heel and the toe. At the heel, so that you're not actually rolling off that edge and doing that, or rolling it up in that method. So having that on a jointer plane is extremely important. However, on a smoothing plane, it's not important at all. That's literally the only difference between these planes, and the length varies on Nagadai Kanna. This one is about, I'm actually going to use a metric ruler for you metrical types. You can see here it's about 39, maybe 40 centimeters or so. I think this is centimeters. You guys can correct me on that. And so the only real difference between a Nagadai Kanna and a regular smoothing Kanna, besides the way it's tuned, is its length. And the longer it is, the more accurate it is. And if we measure out a regular smoothing plane like this one, we're right at about 29 centimeters, so that's quite a bit of difference on that. Now, the longer it is, like I said, the more accurate it will be, but that's really all there is to it with a Nagadai Kanna. If you want a Nagadai, you can actually take the same type of blade, there's nothing different about the blade, the chip breaker, or the pin, and simply cut a longer die for it, and you have yourself a jointer plane. Now, the final type of Kanna I want to talk about is this guy. This is called an Ikigai Kanna. Essentially, this is exactly the same as the smoother that we looked at earlier, except that it has no chip breaker and it has no pin. Now, that doesn't make it a worse plane or a better plane. What it does do, though, is it makes it a much more fine cutting plane. Now, if you look at the mouth on this, and it's just the distance from the edge of the body here to the blade, you notice that it is very, very, very small compared to the mouth on this plane. See, I can look right through that. On this one, it's a little bit tougher. You can almost see through it there. But the difference being that not having a chip breaker means you have to set this blade extremely fine and extremely well before you can expect any kind of decent performance out of it. There's a few guys that do use these as their main planes, but because they're so finicky and they're so fine to set up, it takes a lot of work and a lot of practice and quite a bit of skill to actually get them to work right. This one I have actually been using a tiny bit in my own time, and I just strictly use it as a finishing plane. Most guys will find that you do that. Now, there is another type of plane that doesn't have a chip breaker, and that's the Hirashi Kanna, which is the roughing plane that we made a couple months back. That's a little bit different, though, because that has a much bigger mouth, and it's not a fine plane. This is a very fine plane, just that it's so small right there. The shavings that come out of this are just really, really thin. It's like paper almost. But these are actually the original types of planes. Back in the olden days, before they developed the chip breaker and started using that, this was what Japanese carpenters used. It took quite a bit of skill, took quite a bit of time to get these things set up, but when they were set up right, they were awesome. And the nice thing with doing finishing cuts on these, because they're so fine, you can't necessarily take a really massive thick cut with this very easily. You can get a really nice smooth finish with these because the wood acts as a burnisher, and you do get a really fine clean cut provided your blade is sharpened properly. So those are the three main types of Kanna that you're going to see in Japanese woodworking. You have regular smoothing plane, you have an Ikigai Kanna, and you also have a Nagadai Kanna. So they're all three different, they're all three wonderful, but they all three do completely different jobs. So the nice thing about Kanna is that you don't need a ton of them to get a lot done. With these three here, I could honestly do about 90% of the work that I do. Just doesn't take much to really make them work right. It does take a little bit of setup, but you know, every tool does take time to master. That's the same thing for a drill press or a table saw. You do have to practice, and if you practice enough, you'll eventually get the hang of it and you'll eventually master it. So I hope you guys found that rather educational. Not much to do by way of entertainment these days. I just prefer to talk about stuff I enjoy. Later on this year, my video output is going to drastically diminish because I am expected to become a father. Yes, gonna have our first kid later this year at the end of the summer. Should be quite the life change. Any of you that are parents will know that it is a massive life change. And I'm not going to be giving up the woodworking side of things, but I am going to be considering my family first and foremost. So as you guys are used to the regular uploads every month or so, might be a little bit different going out from here on out, but we'll see what we can do. And if you want to consider supporting me in my woodworking endeavors, consider checking out the Patreon account. There's a link in the description box down below. And a big thank you to the patrons that already do support me. You guys are awesome. Can't do what I do without you guys. And you guys are especially appreciated with the upcoming advent of fatherhood, so that's going to be interesting and fun. As always, thank you guys for watching. Have an awesome day. Arigatou gozaimasu. Sayonara.